Hey there, APHUG team. This is Sanchez with our second installment of our Culture Flipped lecture. Just going to go ahead and take some time to review language. Reminder, of course, language is a cultural trait and it's learned from one generation to another. So a more formal definition, it's a system of communication through the use of speech, a collection of sound understood by a group of people that have the same meaning. In essence, simplest sense is the system of communication. Now, of course, we can refer to language. It can be spoken, it can be written. Many languages, in fact, don't actually have a written component, and more difficult to track the diffusion, of course, and more susceptible for language extinction. And we talked about languages, of course, that are in danger of being extinct through the globalization of dominant languages, for example, English. Alright, so on the screen, when you review language, I want you to make sure that you understand the difference between language classification. So when we talk about language, we can refer to language families, we can refer to language branches, language groups, languages in general, dialects, and accents. So if you look in your textbook or in the packet of the core concepts, I provided you a copy of the language tree. So linguists have organized languages into language trees, and the tree can be subdivided into, of course, a hierarchy. So the way it breaks down is there's actually 19 language families, and each family, of course, has its own branches, and then each branch has its own groups, and each group has its own language. So some major language families you need to be familiar with would be the Indo-European family, the Sino-Tibetan, the Niger-Congo, the Afro-Asiatic, the Austronesian, and the Dravidian language families. Alright, so let's take a look at this slide right now, kind of reviewing the language families. So language families, reminder, is a collection of languages related to each other through common ancestor long before recorded history. So for example, Indo-European is a language family. So some general facts about Indo-European language. So in this case, about 50% of all people actually speak an Indo-European language, most predominantly English. And English is part of the Germanic branch of the Indo-European language family. In fact, maybe I'll take a look at that chart right there, that are branches. So other major branches of the Indo-European language family include the Baltic Slavic, the Romance, and the Indo-Iranian branches. So the origin of the English, or should I say origin of the Indo-European language is referred to as Proto-Indo-European. So new languages developed through language diversification as a result of migration. The location of the hearth of the Proto-Indo-European language is a subject of speculation. Because modern Indo-European languages share words for snow but not sea, the hearth is believed to have been somewhere within the snow but distant from the sea. Linguists estimate its origin may have been between 6,000 and 4,500 BC. So some ideas that you should also associate with the diffusion of Indo-European language. There's something referred to as conquest theory. And basically conquest theory argues that the Indo-European diffusion began in the empire building of the Kurgan culture located in the region of Russia, north of the Caspian Sea. Now, this is a little bit different than also another theory that we could understand or connect to, something called agriculture theory. And agriculture theory of Indo-European diffusion basically argues that the diffusion of the language started from farming communities in Europe's Danube River region valley. Alright, so after we understand the different language families, we also use the classification of language branches. And language branches are a collection of languages related through the common ancestor that existed several years ago. Differences are not as extensive or as old as the language families, and archaeological evidence can confirm that the branches actually derive from the same family. So the groups of languages that share a common ancestor are language family, and in the Indo-European family there are 8 branches. Alright, next as we break down our language families and branches, we go on to the classification of language groups. So language group is a collection of languages within the branch that actually share the common origin in the relatively recent past and display relatively few differences in grammar and vocabulary. A collection of languages from a common origin in the relative recent past. So Germanic language branch, for example, we could break that down to the Northern Germanic and also the Western Germanic. And then finally, we can also start breaking down things further in the terms that language, dialect, and accent. So language is understood among people within a certain group. So again, talking about the English language. A dialect is a regional variety of the language, distinguished by the vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. And we kind of compare and contrast the difference between American English versus British English. How they use different words. Like in English, we use the word line. In Britain, they use the word queue. In English, we use the word elevator. In Britain, they use the word lift. And then not just, again, dialect, but also we can have regional dialect. So again, we have dialect even, in the United States of America, the Southern dialect with unique vocabulary, spelling, and pronunciation. We also can, of course, understand language in terms of an accent, and that's kind of a distinctive manner of oral expression. So when we think about the accents, where you have that Southern accent, or some cases people would think totally we have like a Southern California accent, or if you have, a Boston accent. So if you go back to haiku, there was that fun video we looked at that one actress using all the different dialects and different accents. So that might be a fun video just to review this main concept. All right, so on the screen, again, I just mentioned Boston. So here's kind of a way to kind of break down if we were going all the way back to that Boston accent. So in the base, we're talking about the language family. The language family would be the Indo-European family. The language branch would be the Germanic branch. The language group would be West Germanic. The language, of course, is English. The dialect, we can identify the Northeast region of the United States. And then the accent we can maybe even get to, which is the Boston accent. So this might help you kind of break or understand the difference of how we divide the different categories. All right, so when you're studying the different language families, you also should be familiar with roughly, again, how many people are speaking these types of languages. And super important, of course, making sure you understand what countries, what regions around the world actually use these language families. So annotate that map in your core concepts, be familiar. Remember, if there was an FRQ question or, again, a multiple choice question, it might necessarily tie back to our different language families. Okay, in our language category, you should also be familiar with one of our vocabulary words, which is a pidgin language, which is a form of speech that adopts the simplified grammar and limited vocabulary of a lingua franca, and it's used for communications among speakers of two different languages. I think I might show this slide too, because I feel like this helps you kind of understand the differences between the lingua franca, pidgin, and the Creole language. So I know in class a lot of times few of us want to just jump to, again, English, the lingua franca. Remember, the correct usage of the term lingua franca is a language that's used among speakers of different languages for the purpose of trade and commerce. So we definitely see that English has become the dominant lingua franca, but there are other lingua francas, so I don't want you to forget that. So for example, in Africa, we have the lingua franca Swahili, which is a language that a lot of tribes, since they speak a lot of different types of languages, will use to communicate and trade. And then also on the bottom of the list, we also have the Creole language, and that was the pidgin language that actually has developed into a more complex structure. It's not just necessarily for, barter or trade or communication. It's actually a structure and the vocabulary, and it has actually become the native language of a group of people. All right, last and of course not least, we also tied into this section, we talked about the disappearance of languages. So the fact that we see languages actually going extinct, and linguists actually predict that about half the world's language will be dead or dying by the year 2050. And we talked about in one of our FRQ questions, of course, what we can do to actually try to prevent that. Whether, again, we have a concerted effort by the government to step in and get involved, or again, we have family members trying to teach children. So here's another map to kind of just spatially take a look at. So you can see again, this is the language hotspots, or basically the threat level, of where we see again these indigenous languages being threatened. So again, severe cases we see in South America. We see sort of the northern Inuit people. We also see Siberian languages. We also see issues of language hotspots in Africa. So how that looks around the world. Here's another map. Again, this one map is taking a look at 577 critically endangered languages. So of course in the face of globalization, of course in the face of English diffusing around the world, the question is, of course, if we lose these languages, we're really truly losing a huge element of culture. Because a lot of these language, again, there's different words that may not be able to, translate to different ones. Oftentimes when you sort of switch to languages, again, it gets lost in translation. So really, truly, a lot of linguists are trying to make an effort, not only to record these languages, but actually to make an effort, of course, to make sure that they continue to, be spread down to generation to generation. All right, we'll go ahead and close with, again, the big ideas on the screen. So reminder, of course, you want to hit your chapter notes. You want to hit those reading guides. You want to look over those core concepts. Make sure you're comfortable with these big ideas. Make sure they're annotated. Because actually we've seen quite a few of FRQs, especially taken from language. We had the one on the lingua franca a few years ago. Just last year we had the one looking at English and bilingualism in Canada. And then we also had that one that we used for this particular unit, which was on endangered languages. So College Board wants to make sure you understand language and how it ties to culture. All right, with that, I will go ahead and wrap things up, and I'll see you back in class.